The city sparkled beneath James Bennett's office, a sprawling metropolis full of people scurrying below, each with their own stories, struggles, and aspirations. But James had little interest in the lives of others. From the top floor of Bennett Enterprises, he surveyed the world with a practiced indifference, knowing that, in his view, it all belonged to him. At 38, James Bennett was already one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city. He had built his empire through a combination of shrewd business deals, aggressive takeovers, and, when necessary, ruthless competition. He thrived on power and control and had little patience for anyone who couldn't keep up with his relentless ambition. And that included his secretary, Eliza Torres. Eliza had been working for James for almost 5 years. She was efficient, organized, and most importantly, unflinchingly loyal, traits that made her invaluable to James's operations. Yet, despite her dedication, James rarely acknowledged her efforts. To him, Eliza was simply part of the well-oiled machine that served him. Eliza sat at her desk just outside James's office, typing away furiously as she juggled phone calls, emails, and meetings, all while organizing James's schedule down to the minute. She'd learned to handle his high-stress demands, but today was testing even her limits. "Eliza!" James barked through the intercom, his tone impatient and sharp. "Where's my coffee? I've been waiting for 5 minutes." Suppressing a sigh, Eliza quickly picked up the cup she'd prepared and walked into his office, placing it on his desk with a practiced, polite smile. "Here you go, Mr. Bennett, freshly brewed." James barely looked up from his laptop. "Finally, don't make me wait again." Eliza clenched her teeth, willing herself to stay calm. She was used to his attitude by now, but each dismissive comment chipped away at her patience. It wasn't just the coffee. It was the endless hours, the late-night calls, and the constant demands that left her drained. As she returned to her desk, her phone buzzed. It was her mother, asking if she'd be able to make it to dinner tonight. Eliza hesitated before replying. She knew it was unlikely she'd leave before 9, as usual. And even if she did, she'd be too exhausted to enjoy the time with her family. Later that evening, as the city lights sparkled against the night sky, James wrapped up his work and prepared to leave. He had plans with a group of friends, other high-powered executives who shared his taste for luxury and exclusivity. These were his social circle, people who admired his success and indulged in the same lavish lifestyle. At the upscale bar, James entertained his friends with tales of his latest deals and acquisitions. They laughed, toasted to his victories, and showered him with admiration. Yet beneath the surface, James felt a hollowness he didn't want to acknowledge. These friendships were as shallow as the cocktails they drank, built on mutual benefits rather than genuine connection. But James wasn't the type to dwell on such thoughts. He shrugged them off, immersing himself in the praise, feeding his ego until the late hours. The next morning, Eliza arrived early, bleary-eyed from a night spent catching up on work she couldn't finish the day before. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, stacked James's papers in neat piles, and mentally prepared herself for another day of demands and dismissive remarks. James arrived shortly after, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, looking every bit the powerful businessman. Without so much as a greeting, he snapped his fingers, indicating that he wanted his coffee. Eliza obliged, bringing it to his desk. "Any calls for me?" he asked, already engrossed in his emails. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. There's a message from Mr. Landry regarding the merger and a few meeting requests I've tentatively scheduled for next week." "Good. You've got one thing right, at least." Eliza swallowed the urge to respond. She knew better than to engage. In James's world, there was no room for weakness, and defending herself would only provoke him. So, she focused on her tasks, taking comfort in knowing she was doing her job well, even if he refused to see it. Unbeknownst to both of them, fate was about to intervene in a way neither could have predicted. A week later, James had an important meeting with a potential investor, one he believed could secure the largest expansion in his company's history. Eager to close the deal, he left his office in a rush, ignoring Eliza's offer to rearrange his afternoon so he wouldn't be late. As he sped through the city in his sleek sports car, his mind was focused on the numbers, the profit margins, and the potential benefits of the deal. His thoughts raced faster than the car, consuming his attention, Then, in an instant, it happened. A truck ran a red light, colliding with his car with a force that threw him against his seatbelt. The world spun, metal twisted, and glass shattered. As the sirens grew louder, the weight of his injury settled into his mind, and fear, real, paralyzing fear, began to creep in. When James finally regained consciousness, he found himself in a sterile hospital room, the sharp smell of antiseptics filling the air. His body was battered, limbs immobilized, with a cast on his leg and bandages covering the cuts along his face. The doctors informed him that he would need to stay in bed for months, followed by a lengthy period on crutches. The news struck him like another blow, the reality settling in that he wouldn't be returning to his old life anytime soon. At first, his friends visited. They brought gifts, offered encouragement, and promised to stay in touch. But as days turned into weeks, their visits became less frequent, their messages less enthusiastic. He sensed their impatience, their discomfort with his vulnerability, and slowly they stopped coming altogether. Eliza, however, continued to show up. She brought him documents to review, updates from the office, and meals he'd once demanded she fetch without a thought. Despite everything, she maintained her professionalism, ensuring he was taken care of. But James was still James. Even bedridden, he was demanding, impatient, and often rude. He criticized the hospital food, complained about her choice of updates, and insisted she rearrange his schedule to accommodate his recovery, though she was already juggling far more than he could see. The irony was lost on him. Here was the one person who had stayed by his side, even in his most helpless state, and he treated her as he always had, with entitlement. Each day with James left Eliza more drained. She handled his complaints, the never-ending requests, and the constant reminders that her efforts were unappreciated. Her nights grew shorter, her sleep more restless, as she tried to keep up with both his demands and her personal life. But she endured. For now, one evening after a particularly grueling day, Eliza returned to James's room, dark circles under her eyes. She had barely slept the night before, spending hours catching up on work she hadn't managed to finish during the day. As she handed him a report, James glanced at it and frowned. "You call this organized? I told you to make sure these were sorted by quarter, not month. Do I have to do everything myself?" The words struck a nerve. Eliza's patience snapped. "Enough, James," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I have done everything for you, everything, and all I get in return is disrespect and criticism. You have no idea what it's like to work for someone who treats you like you don't matter." James blinked, startled by her outburst. "If you keep this up," she continued, "you'll push away everyone who cares about you. No one wants to be around someone who only sees their own reflection. One day, you'll wake up and realize you're completely alone." With that, Eliza turned and walked out, leaving James in stunned silence. Her words echoed in his mind, filling the empty room and gnawing at his thoughts. For the first time, James saw a glimpse of himself through someone else's eyes, a man who valued nothing but his own ego, pushing away everyone who tried to care. It was a realization he couldn't ignore. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter, focusing on James's initial attempts at changing, his discomfort with vulnerability, and his journey toward understanding others? After Elisa's departure that evening, James lay in bed, the silence pressing down on him. Her words rang in his head, forcing him to confront the bitter truth of who he had become. He'd always seen himself as powerful, capable, and in control. But now, stripped of his status, bedridden and reliant on others, he felt small, vulnerable. It was a feeling he despised. Yet, as he replayed Elisa's words, something inside him shifted. For the first time, he saw his life from another perspective. He saw the moments he'd brushed off her efforts, dismissed her concerns, and ordered her around without a second thought. Shame crept in, tinged with regret. The following day, Eliza arrived at his room, her expression guarded. She avoided eye contact, going about her tasks without her usual efficiency. James, sensing the weight of her resentment, swallowed his pride. The words he planned felt foreign, awkward, and hesitant. "Eliza," he began, voice faltering, I wanted to say thank you." Eliza looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Thank you?" He nodded, feeling an uncomfortable heat rise in his cheeks. For everything you've done. I know. I haven't been the easiest person to work for. Eliza's surprise gave way to a wary glance. No, you haven't, she replied honestly. James shifted, unused to the vulnerability her straightforwardness demanded. I'll try to do better, he managed, stumbling over the words. Apologizing wasn't a skill he'd ever practiced, and now he wished he had. Eliza nodded slowly. I appreciate that, James, she said, her voice softer. She was skeptical, but she couldn't deny that his attempt, however clumsy, felt genuine. The small gesture hinted at a crack in his otherwise impenetrable exterior, and though she held her reservations, she found herself cautiously hopeful. Over the next few weeks, James made subtle efforts to change his approach with Eliza. He began saying thank you when she brought him reports, and he restrained his usual outbursts, catching himself before snapping at her over small matters. These adjustments were challenging, but as James observed Eliza's guarded responses, he realized how little he understood about her. He noticed her exhaustion, the fatigue lining her eyes and her persistent dedication despite his past treatment. He couldn't help but feel both admiration and guilt. While she appreciated his efforts, Eliza remained wary. James's change, however small, didn't erase years of mistreatment. She allowed herself to acknowledge his attempts, but held back from fully trusting his newfound humility. Her boundaries were set, and she wasn't about to let her guard down easily. Still, she responded to his efforts with tentative kindness. Her days grew a little lighter, and she noticed, with a quiet satisfaction, that James's demanding nature had softened. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. Weeks later, during one of their brief conversations, Eliza casually mentioned her weekend plans to volunteer at a local food pantry. She didn't expect James to take any interest. She'd only mentioned it in passing. But to her surprise, James's curiosity was piqued. What do you do there? He asked, genuinely intrigued. I help organize donations, serve food, that kind of thing, she replied. It's not much, but it helps the community. It's a way to give back. James pondered her words. His life had always revolved around accumulating wealth and status, but hearing Eliza speak so earnestly about her volunteer work stirred something within him. Maybe. I could come along sometime. The words left his mouth before he could fully consider them. Instantly, he regretted it, fearing he'd overstepped a boundary. Eliza raised an eyebrow, caught off guard. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Are you serious? Yes, James replied, surprising even himself. I think it could. I don't know. Be worth seeing. After a pause, Eliza nodded. All right, this Saturday. Just be prepared to work. James gave a nervous smile, unsure of what he was getting himself into. When Saturday arrived, James found himself standing outside a modest building on the edge of the city, his usual tailored suit replaced by a simple shirt and jeans. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to his office, humble, warm, filled with volunteers and community members bustling about, each with their own purpose. Eliza greeted him at the door, a hint of amusement in her eyes. Didn't think you'd actually show. James chuckled, feeling out of place. Neither did I. As they moved inside, Eliza introduced him to the other volunteers, people who welcomed him warmly despite his clear discomfort. He was assigned to organizing shelves of canned goods, a task that felt foreign and mundane compared to his usual work. But as he worked, he began to notice the interactions around him. Volunteers laughing, talking with patrons, creating an environment of genuine care. Over the next few hours, James found himself drawn into conversations with the volunteers. There was Greg, a retired teacher who spent his weekends helping at the pantry, and Linda, a single mother who volunteered despite her own struggles. Their stories fascinated James, giving him a glimpse into lives he'd never considered before. Gradually, he felt himself letting go of his usual defenses. Here, his wealth and status meant nothing. These people valued kindness and compassion, qualities James had rarely prioritized. He realized, with a pang of shame, how disconnected he'd been from the world outside his office. At the end of the day, as he and Eliza walked back to their cars, James was uncharacteristically quiet. Eliza noticed and gave him a curious look. Thoughts? She asked. It's different, James admitted, struggling to articulate his feelings. I've spent my whole life focused on success. But these people, they seem happier than I am. And they don't have nearly as much. Eliza nodded. Happiness doesn't always come from money, James. Sometimes it's about connection and purpose. Her words resonated deeply with him, sparking a shift in his perspective. For the first time, he questioned the choices he'd made, wondering if the success he'd chased was worth the emptiness it left behind. As the weeks passed, James continued to volunteer at the food pantry, forging genuine friendships with the people he met there. He discovered a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known he was missing, a purpose that went beyond profit and power. But more than anything, he found himself drawn to Eliza in ways he hadn't anticipated. He began to notice her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about something she cared about. He admired her kindness, her resilience, and the quiet strength she showed every day. It dawned on him slowly, almost imperceptibly, that his feelings for her went beyond gratitude or admiration. He'd fallen for her. The realization left him both exhilarated and terrified. He knew he didn't deserve her, not after how he'd treated her, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what he felt. James's newfound emotions presented a challenge. Vulnerability was foreign to him, and expressing his feelings was something he'd avoided his entire life. He feared rejection, feared losing the one person who'd stood by him. But he couldn't deny his need to show her that he was a changed man, someone worthy of her trust. So he began with small gestures, carrying out tasks to lighten her workload, showing genuine interest in her life, and letting his guard down during conversations. Slowly, he tried to prove his sincerity, hoping she'd see the man he was becoming. James continued his subtle courtship, careful not to overwhelm Eliza. He knew she was wary, that she had every reason to doubt his intentions, but he also sensed a quiet openness in her, a tentative willingness to let him prove himself. They shared moments at the food pantry, lingering conversations about life and laughs. As the weeks passed, James's gestures grew bolder, though he remained cautious. He'd bring her coffee without being asked, pick up small details about her favorite snacks, and, occasionally, surprise her with small tokens. A new book he thought she'd like, or a warm scarf for the chilly mornings. Each gesture was met with a mixture of surprise and guarded appreciation. Eliza seemed unsure of how to react, but didn't pull away. During one of their shifts at the food pantry, James found himself alongside her at the sorting table. As they worked in comfortable silence, he glanced over, catching a smile on her face as she interacted with the other volunteers. "Thank you, he said suddenly, catching her off guard. Eliza turned, curious. "For what?" "For showing me this place," James replied, his voice sincere. "And for putting up with me, even when I didn't deserve it." Eliza looked at him, her expression softening. "You're different now, James," she said after a pause. "I don't know if it's this place or something else, but you're not the man I met years ago." Hearing her acknowledge his change sparked a warmth in James that he hadn't felt in a long time. He took a steadying breath, knowing it was time to be honest. "There's something I need to say, Eliza," he began, his tone vulnerable. "Being around you, seeing the way you live your life with kindness and purpose, it's changed me. You've changed me. I've realized that I care about you." Eliza's eyes widened slightly, surprise flashing across her face, and for a moment James felt his heart pounding, fearing he'd said too much. But Eliza didn't turn away. Instead, she took a deep breath, seeming to weigh her words carefully. I care about you too, James," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard for me to trust this, after everything." James nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know, and I don't expect anything from you at least, not right away. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm willing to take the time to earn your trust, whatever it takes." Eliza offered a small, tentative smile. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "And I think we can take it one day at a time." The next few months were marked by steady, cautious progress. James and Eliza grew closer, taking small steps toward trust and vulnerability. Their friendship deepened, and with each passing day, James felt himself falling further, not just for her kindness, but for her strength and authenticity. Together, they continued volunteering at the food pantry, sharing the simple joys of working side by side. James found himself drawn into Eliza's world in ways he never expected. He learned about her family, her love for literature, and her dreams of making a difference. With each new piece of her he discovered, his admiration grew. One evening, as they finished up a shift, James suggested they grab a coffee nearby. They walked through the bustling streets, talking easily, and James realized how much he cherished these simple moments with her, moments where he could just be himself without the armor of success and wealth. Over coffee, their conversation turned reflective, and Eliza, feeling safe in his company, shared some of her own struggles and insecurities. James listened intently, feeling honored that she trusted him enough to share her vulnerable side. "Sometimes I wonder if all of this trying to make a difference is enough," she admitted, looking down at her coffee. James reached across the table, gently placing his hand over hers. "You make a bigger difference than you know, Eliza," he said earnestly. "And you've made a difference in me. You've shown me what it means to care about others." Eliza looked up, meeting his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of warmth and surprise. In that moment, something shifted between them, a silent understanding, an unspoken promise that their relationship was growing into something meaningful and lasting. Several weeks later, on a crisp autumn evening, James found the courage to fully open his heart. He invited Eliza to dinner, choosing a quiet, intimate restaurant that overlooked the city lights. They shared stories and laughter, both aware of the gentle tension that had been building between them. After dinner, James took her hand as they walked through the city's quiet streets. As they reached a nearby park, he turned to her, his expression serious yet vulnerable. "Eliza, I have to say this," he began, his voice soft but resolute. "You've given me a second chance, not just at life, but at understanding what really matters. And it's made me realize that what matters most to me is you." Eliza's breath caught, and he continued, holding her gaze. "I love you, Eliza. I never thought I'd feel this way, but you've shown me that love isn't about power or control. It's about connection, trust, and respect. I know I have a lot to prove, but I want to spend my life doing just that, if you'll let me." Eliza's eyes glistened, and after a pause, she gave him a soft, radiant smile. "James, I love you too," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But it's taken me a long time to reach this point. I'll need time to fully trust. But I believe in you, in who you've become." James felt his heart swell with joy, and he pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close as they both soaked in the moment, a quiet promise shared between them. In the months that followed, James and Eliza built a life together based on mutual respect and understanding. James continued his involvement at the food pantry, dedicating more time to helping others and forging friendships with people from all walks of life. His business flourished, not because of his former ruthlessness, but because he'd found a new purpose in creating opportunities for those around him. Their relationship deepened as they supported each other's dreams. Eliza, once his overlooked secretary, had become his partner in every sense. She inspired him to live with compassion and purpose, and in return he supported her, encouraging her to pursue her own ambitions. James's life was now filled with moments of gratitude and humility. He no longer cared about superficial success. Instead, he valued the connections he'd made, especially the one he shared with Eliza. The journey from narcissism to empathy had been long and challenging, but in the end, it had led him to a life richer than he'd ever imagined. Hand in hand, they faced the world together, their bond unbreakable, their love a testament to the power of change, forgiveness, and second chances. If you enjoyed this video and want more heartwarming stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. May the love inside your heart blossom.